a certain level of vulnerability, kindness, all the Brene things.
Empathy, that's all.
Beautiful. I'm so grateful to see everyone here. There's like lots of people that this is your first time coming. And then of course there's lots of long time Trauma Training Tuesday fans that I'm always so grateful for. It's like every single time I say this, but it's amazing to have an audience to talk about trauma, right? When we started this, like nobody really, we thought, who's gonna want to talk about this? But people want to talk about this because it's our life. This is impacting all of us. And, you know, the kind of the years through this pandemic, I've realized more and more and more and more, our systems are about trauma, our life experience, like it's in our families, it's generational, it's big, it's heavy, and it's past time to pay attention to it. So I'm really glad that people are in agreement that it's something we need to attend to. I'm thrilled for the third time to have Reverend Payson here. We started Trauma Training Tuesday in 2020, I think, at the beginning. We had a couple actual live and in-person ones in Worcester, Massachusetts. And then when COVID hit the beginning of March, the very first speaker that we had on the deck was Aaron. And he already had adapted to the Zoom life because of COVID for his congregation. So he was the very first one to take our show into the internet space. So I'm really glad about that. And he's back for a third time. The first time, that was 2 years ago, he was going to talk about grief and loss that comes from death, you know, a lot of the time. And then because of the pandemic, he completely was able to switch gears and give us a kind of a more overview of what we might expect emotionally and physically and all the pieces. So I couldn't be more pleased to have all of you here. Thank you so much. You saw we're being recorded and live streamed. I know that it can be a little hard to be in such a sort of personal space and know you're being recorded or live streamed. But it's so valuable for other people to be able to watch at their own time and their own convenience. So we really appreciate your allowing us to do that. In addition to Aaron Payson, my BFF, Dr. Joyce McNickles, is here. She has been willing to, Sharon's like, Joyce, yay. She's willing to sort of talk through with Aaron some of the things that have really particularly been challenging her. I have to say, Aaron, you know I love you for so many reasons, but this grief space, you are the best I know. I don't know anyone else who's more comforting, who has more kind of big picture, words of wisdom. You have been such a comfort to me, and I know to so many people here. And of course, Joyce has had so many losses. I was like, you gotta talk to Aaron. And you did not let either of us down. And I know that she's not alone, being someone here who has had some pretty significant grief experiences lately. So Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you. My dog is like scratching at the door. He wants to get in on it. So I'm just going to mute and go off camera for a second. Turn it over. If you're not speaking, if you wouldn't mind muting, that would be great. If you could use the chat, you could introduce yourself in the chat. That's always awesome. And if you want to say where you're from, I know many are from Worcester, but some people are not. And that's it. And I'm going to zip it.
Thank you so much. Let me find Joyce here. And so, thank you very much for that introduction, Amy. I'm humbled to be in this space, and I will say to you that, you know, while I spend a lot of time in grief spaces, my joy is really working with people to discover not only the, you know, the challenge of their grief, but also to help them discover or recover a sense of resiliency in meeting the challenges of that grief. we're in a space right now that is largely defined because of our common experience of a pandemic that currently, on a daily basis, is the cause of about 4.0 to 4.5% of worldwide deaths. And since the beginning of the pandemic itself has accounted for almost 5% of worldwide deaths. Statistics are an interesting thing to use in relationship to the kind of experience we've had, because they both reflect a magnitude of the experience, but they also reflect a distancing. And much of the news reports that we receive that talk about the numbers of deaths and the people who have died have been opportunities for us to reflect on the state of the pandemic in our community. But what often gets lost in that process are the personal narratives, the proximity of the experience, especially as we have faced a pandemic that has caused us to be at a personal distance. One of the things that we've lost is physical proximity to each other. And so I think it's very important that if we're going to talk about grief and loss within the context of the pandemic, that we talk about it both in terms of its dynamics, but also within the context of the personal narratives that embody it. So I am honored and humbled to be able to share this space with Dr. Joyce McNickles, whose experience early on in the pandemic reflects the experience of so many others in our community, in our commonwealth, in our country, and in our world. And I want this time to be a time that we are able to think about the ways in which we have been impacted, first of all. Secondly, for us to discover the ways that we can be most effective in companioning people who have been impacted. And thirdly, to think a bit about projecting ourselves into the future, to think about what kind of future needs individuals, families, and communities are going to have related to the lingering effects of the pandemic. I want to begin by talking about the fact that, one of the most significant dynamics of this pandemic has been the fact that it has challenged, or it has transformed, what is referred to in the field as our assumptive world, right? And what we mean by that is that we have been challenged if we have experienced the world as safe, predictable, and benevolent. This particular experience has rocked us to our core. I say if because I think it's really important to understand the varied experience of people in our community. There are people who have never felt safe in our communities or safe in their homes. There are people who have never felt that the world was predictable or that it was particularly benevolent, depending on what their experience has been. And it's really important to me, especially as we think about the varied impact of the pandemic, to be able to broaden the scope from our own experience to consider the fact that it is not the same experience across the board. And here's one example. There are many of us on this Zoom and many of us in our community that have had to make the transition into working from home. And I'll say to you that for many of us, we have spent the last 2 years in part kvetching about having to be on Zoom all the time, or to make this transition and the loss of the kind of personal space that the personal presence that we might have had. And some of us have felt the freedom of being able to go to work in our pajama pants. And we've been able to be more relaxed and as productive potentially in those environments, which has caused us to think differently about what it means to go back to work, if you will. Many companies considering the possibility of losing their their common office spaces and inviting people to work from home. But it is also important to think about that as a matter of privilege. That for many people in our community, they did not have the option to work from home, or they did not have access to the technology that would make that option viable. And that that experience needs to be counted among the primary experiences and reflected as something that adds to the burden associated with a pandemic and the grief that can be associated with the pandemic, and what makes grief complicated in so many different ways as one dynamic of a complicating factor. So thinking about our assumptive worlds and thinking about the fact that we have experienced a pandemic where most of the deaths have occurred within the first couple of weeks after diagnosis. So in an era of time where chronic disease has often given us a considerable amount of time to adjust to the fatal reality of many of our chronic disease processes, and to allow us to adjust to this reality, this pandemic has been an amalgam of experiences that are more akin to sudden death, in the sense that it is a very short time when death has occurred, and that it is complicated by the fact that the normative ways that we would respond to this reality have been hampered. We have not been able to accompany those that we love that are in the dying process through that journey personally. We've often had to do it at a distance, over a screen or over a phone, for those who have experienced that. We add to that the reality that the pandemic has challenged the ways that we do the normative things in our life. I do not remember a time in my life where I thought shopping was a life-risking event. Nor did we have, prior to the pandemic, a more common experience of what it meant to be an essential worker, where we see delivery people and grocery store clerks and mechanics and, a variety of people that our lives have depended on in ways that we haven't hitherto thought of, as well as those that we have always considered on the front line, but perhaps not as acutely as we have experienced it now in terms of our healthcare, first response communities, and others, including funeral directors. So we have been hampered in terms of the progress of the disease process itself and the kinds of experiences that it has mitigated against for us in the community. So I want to stop there for a moment, and I want to turn to Joyce. And Joyce, bless you and thank you for taking the time to be here. I know that this is both an important experience, and it is a courageous one as far as I'm concerned, given all that you have been through personally. And so my thanks to you for being here. I wonder if you would share with us what happened to you and your family during the pandemic.
Yeah. So I'm looking at who's on the call, and I know many of you know Carlo, and you have experienced us together as a couple over these the last 29 years we were together. Carlo had a couple of issues in the fall of 2019 that they were basically rectified. Came January 2020. So we thought, but then he developed an infection as a result of a surgery that he had in the fall. And as you all remember, during that time, like in January, actually starting like in February, hospitals were saying they didn't really want people to be coming unless things were really important. And so I had to advocate for him to be seen, and eventually by his physician. And eventually we did find out that he had a really bad infection. We found out that the day that we had gone to see his doctor at the hospital. And when we got home, 15 minutes later, he passed out and I never saw him again. That was April 21st. So he had an infection that went sepsis and he was in ICU for 7 days. And then they moved him to a regular floor as he was awaiting to have a surgery done that he still needed. And it took about 3 weeks for the infection to completely clear before they could do the surgery. And on the day after he had the surgery, they called to tell me that he had been in a room with someone who had the virus. And naively, I was thinking, oh, that doesn't mean that he's going to get it, but he did. And he was gone about 4 weeks later, maybe three weeks later. And so I talked with him every day. He was in the hospital till 6 weeks. I talked with him every day, multiple times a day via Zoom. And then the last week and a half, when he was on and off the ventilator, I was able to speak with him. And, I said my goodbyes to him up on the deck. We have a deck on top of our house. And that was Carlos' favorite space. And I was there with friends and family, and we said our goodbyes. And of course, I'm talking about it now, without a lot of, what some people might think is not, I'm not necessarily in my voice reflecting the kind of trauma that the whole experience was for me and for those other people who were with me at that time. And Amy was one of them who was there right with me. And so I have another loss, 2 other losses. And so I don't really know how much I'm going to focus on one or the other, but and I'll just sort of give you the recap of what happened in terms of the losses. So I lost my husband, and then the following summer, not quite a year, I lost my animal companion, Zora. And again, I never saw, she left the house. I brought her to emergency care at Tufts, and I never saw her again either. I really didn't think that would be the last that I would see Zora. And for some of you who, follow me on Facebook, Zora, she had all kinds of angst. She brought so much joy to my life, also vexed me so much, but I didn't expect to lose her so suddenly. And again, not be able to, to say goodbye to her. And then a few months after that, in October of 2021, as I was, I went to Scotland to spread Carlos' ashes. And again, a little bit naively, because none of us had dealt with something as traumatic as this type of a pandemic before. And so I thought in the summer of 2020 that I would be able to go to Scotland in the fall of 2020 to spread Carlos' ashes. I really did. And I didn't realize that it was going to be almost a year later before I could safely go. And so while I was in Scotland, my mom, 2.5 weeks later, after I arrived in Scotland, my mom went into the hospital. And I had this sort of I don't know if it was a premonition or what, but I had a fear, I guess. I had verbalized it to several people, Amy being one of them. I had planned to be gone for 7 weeks. And I said, what if my mom gets sick while I'm gone? My mom had been on dialysis for 10 years and she had done relatively well during that time, but the last year she was having some problems. And so, I never imagined what I feared would really happen though. And so on a Sunday, my sister called and told me that my mom had gone into the hospital and that there wasn't really much they could do. They couldn't continue the dialysis for her any longer. And so I had planned to spread Carlos' ashes with my Scottish friends on that Saturday of that week. So I spoke with my mom on Monday via FaceTime. And again, it was very surreal. I couldn't believe that I was doing this again, that I was saying goodbye to somebody through FaceTime and across the ocean, right? It was just a weird juxtaposition of me releasing Carlo's ashes in the backdrop of my mom's spirit soon to be released. So I spoke with her on Monday. My friends tried to keep me soothed. That's the best word I can use between Monday and the day that she passed on Thursday. She told me not to come home. You know, I couldn't if I wanted to at that point. Again, because of the pandemic, you have to have a 3-day prior to your departure. You need a 3-day prior COVID test. So, and it takes time to organize all of that. She said, stay until you do the ashes. She knew I was doing them on that Saturday. She passed on Thursday, and my friends and I, you know, we packed up stuff and we drove over this to Sky across the Sky Bridge, and that was like a 5-hour journey. So I spread his ashes. It felt really cathartic to me to do that. But all the time in my mind, I'm thinking about my mom. And so, yeah, it was quite an experience to be, it's something very, I don't know, I still haven't found the words yet. Maybe I don't need to find the words. I don't know, but maybe I just need to feel it. But there's something about when you lose someone and you're at least, like with Carlo, I lost Carlo, but I was in the same country. I was like here, you know what I mean? I was here. And I had my family and my friends, and I had my Scottish friends when I was there, when my mom passed, and they're like family to me, but it just feels odd to be away in that way, like really away. You know, when Carlo was in the hospital, I had my friends and family, but I knew he was just at UMass, you know. That's what happened, Aaron. And I know I'm leaving out a lot of stuff, but I don't want to, you know, I can share, maybe I can send it to Amy and then she could drop it in the chat window. It's a link to, they did an interview with me in the Worcester Telegram about what happened to Carlo, the details. And I also drafted from my own sake. And this is what I from my own experience, what I would share with people. When you're going through trauma, you don't remember stuff, right? So like, I knew that I needed to write stuff down, the timeline of events that would happen to him. And so I wrote a timeline, and I can share that with Amy and she can share it with people. Yeah, so I'll stop there, Aaron.
Joyce, your experience is extraordinarily powerful. And it reflects a variety of different dynamics of what people have gone through. And I just want to highlight some of the things that I heard. And, one of the issues around the pandemic and the issue of grief is that we're not talking about an event of grief. We're talking about layers of events of grief. And your story manifests itself in terms of a series of death losses.
Mm-hmm.
And the other way that I hear it expressed in the community and within other narrative, other people's stories, is it's the death of a loved one. It is the loss of income and potentially having to move. It is, trying to figure out how to navigate work and kids at home from school. It's and in almost every situation, and particularly acute for you in your story, is the loss of proximity. Having to figure out how to navigate intimate relationships through different media. Not so much your experience in Scotland, but certainly your experience here in Worcester. And I simply want to highlight that as one of the dynamics of this particular time period, that we have a layered experience of grief. I wonder what lingers for you in all of this? What kinds of things come back to you as you have, come out of these experiences and are moving into other experiences, but you're carrying with you a great deal? So what kinds of things have lingered?
Well, I think because, well, I just want to go, let me just think about what lingers for me, specifically around Carlo and that loss. And then I'll move on to my mom. I think, given that Carlo's death was unnecessary, I mean, what death is necessary, right? But Carlo's death, and like so many others, hundreds of thousands, closing in on 1 million, could have been, so many of them could have been prevented had our government acted sooner. And I'm just going to be very specific. People know that I've spoken about this. It's in, it's been the newspaper. Okay, so Carlo, as I shared, Carlo got the virus from being in the hospital with somebody who had it. His room was changed 4 times while he was there. He was vulnerable already because he had come off of a sepsis infection. So even back then, we knew that we should try our best to maintain social distancing, right? You cannot social distance in a hospital room with a curtain between you and the other person. He should have had a single room. There's so many injustices about his death and others' deaths. I only know the details of my spouse's death. So I'm going to focus on, what I clearly saw were the injustices that, and everybody who knows me knows that if I see something that is unjust, I'm just compelled to every last fiber of my being, all the resources that I have, I put into, trying my best to rectify that. And for me not to be able to right this wrong for somebody that I loved more than anything leaves, again, I don't have the words to describe it. I do know that in the initial stages, I was really, really angry. And perhaps I still have anger. But after I've used my resources, I've, to do what I could do to, bring about some justice, I realize I can't do anything. Hospitals have blanket immunity, right now. And I just, I have to kind of let that go. So that lingers for me, like the fact that I don't feel like justice was, justice was done for Carlo. So in my own way, I try to, to what I think brings about some justice, and that is tell his story, tell my story, talk about Carlo's life. I talk about all the things that that he's done and the impact that he's had on his students and on his friends and his family. That's the way that I feel like I can do some justice so that his life, his passing isn't just like another number. And so that lingers for me. It lingers for me around, just not being able to, again, because of the pandemic, give him the kind of public mourning, just what you do in normal times, right? He had so many students that loved him. And, Carlo came from he had a small nuclear family. He had just one sibling. He has his son, my stepson from his previous marriage, but he had a very large extended Italian-American family with lots of cousins and second cousins and, friends of the family. And none of those folks in that broader circle could be at Carlo's funeral, but I have to say, I have to acknowledge where I'm blessed, the fact that when he died on May 29th, at least at that point, they were allowing people to gather in places of worship in small numbers. So, I see Sister Sharon Henderson, and she attends my service. She's one of the clergy at this church, and we were able to have, a small gathering. And so And then, of course, back here at my home. And again, one of the things I've learned is you need to acknowledge where you have had blessings. And the fact that Carlo passed in May, where it's warm, it was a huge blessing because I could have people gather here at my house outdoors safely. There are people who lost loved ones in the dead of winter, and they could not experience, for obvious reasons because of the pandemic, people coming to their home to support them. They may have been able to do that, but not necessarily in good numbers, right? Safely. I have a space, an outdoor space, and people could come here, and we were outdoors a lot. We had his gathering after the service here at my home, so I'm grateful, for that. I'm grateful that for my mother, we were able to do that as well. My mother passed in October. We had a service in, like the first week in November. We still couldn't have large numbers at the church, but afterwards, God blessed us with a wonderful sunny day. And my family was able to gather here at my home safely, outside.
There is so much that you have just described that I think is important for us to acknowledge. I want to go back to your sense of if only, which is really very important for us to remember as communities. Two things come to mind for me. The first is that I think that the larger context of the if onlys, we see that in the history of pandemics, and it plays out in a variety of ways. One of the ways that it plays out is that many of our most substantial movements for broadening justice and broadening human rights have occurred after significant experiences of death and trauma in the world. So in relationship to the world wars and our Civil War, when you look at the history just following that, many people took that sense of this is not right, this should not have happened this way, and moved that energy into a public space following the experience that broadened the scope of rights for children and women, for those who have disabilities, for LGBTQ rights, you name it. A lot of movements toward broadening our own understanding of human rights have occurred in those contexts, as well as advances in the systems that we used that were either overwhelmed or insufficient in response to those traumatic experiences. So one of the things moving forward, I think, is the technologies associated with being able to diagnose, SARS-CoV-2 in a more quick fashion, the means of being able to get medicine on the market in a way that is sufficient to protect the population. There are all kinds of measures like that. More importantly, I think, are the substantial inequities that have been surfaced by the pandemic related to the inequitable distribution of medical resources, the inequitable access to medical insurance, the histories associated in marginalized communities related to science and medicine, where those communities have experienced tremendous suffering at the hands of those institutions. I'm thinking here of the Tuskegee experiments as an example of that, and the forced sterilization of women, especially women of color at various points in our history, and indigenous women, that have caused those communities to have a reasonable amount of skepticism about engaging this, and that we will find ways of being able to provide a more equitable means of people to gain access to these things. There are some other things associated with that, which is simply the acknowledgement of systemic racism,
Yeah.
and how it affects us if we think about the fact that, and I'm looking here at this, that the rate of death for COVID-19 among Black Americans is 2.8 times greater than white Americans. And that one of the ways that we need to think about this is the fact that often our communities of color are have access to lower paying jobs that require more contact with others, which want us to think about the essential workers that we have identified, and don't have because of the nature of those jobs, don't have the opportunity to work from home, or are in jobs where they didn't have adequate access to personal protective equipment, or in institutions that didn't require, I didn't see that should have been mandated. And I think about in Carlos' case, what it would have been like if the institution had the presence of mind to isolate folks more thoroughly. Access to health insurance and other benefits, the existence of pre-existing health problems that are the result of being in environments that would potentially cause those health problems that are linked specifically to what we might call environmental racism, as another thing, and all manner of racial disparities in healthcare. Including the fact that Black Americans and Brown Americans have less savings in comparison to white Americans in this country, and so that it's harder to leave a job. Right. It's harder to make that transition, and it's harder to find resources. I'm thinking about the experience with your mom. I know personally a number of families who have been saddled with the reality that they have traditionally relied on previous generations to be primary care for their children. And in this pandemic, that has been thwarted because many of the folks that they would rely on are more susceptible to disease. And so it has, all kinds of expansions that way. Or not expansions, but all kinds of issues that have done this. And then finally, the issue of the digital divide, the access to technology itself to do this.
Aaron,
all a part of this.
Can I just say something? I'm so glad you thought about the access to technology. I know that, oh God, I know I can't fix everything, and it's not really helpful for me to worry about people that I don't even know, but it's like I couldn't help but think throughout this whole experience with Carlo, what would it have been like for somebody who didn't know how to use technology, right? When Carlo was in the hospital in the fall, where he had needed surgery back in fall 2019. Actually, no, wait a minute. This was, I got my timeline. And when he went in on April 21st, I'm sorry, he was, when he went that time, the final time, he was having, his infection was in his neck and he was having difficulty keeping his neck up, And so I had to figure out how he could call me, because he like holding the phone in his hand like this was uncomfortable. So I had to, and of course I couldn't get there. So I Googled about accessibility features, for the iPhone so that he could call me without having to wait for a nurse or a CNA to come in. I got him a little stand attachment that I asked the nurse over the phone to attach to his bed. I dropped it off in the lobby and they attached it to his bed so that he could voice activate call me whenever he wanted to. And I could call him whenever I wanted to without him having to reach for the phone to say hello. I had it set for automatic answer. And these are things that I found out just from just Googling, and nobody's going to tell you any of this, right? Because they're just trying to do the healthcare part of it at the hospital, right? Nobody's going to tell, and my first language is English. That's what I think about all the time. I got my first language is English. I have, a formal education, an advanced formal education. So I know how to access things. I just imagine if your first language is not English, you don't have any formal training on how to research things, what do? You're lost. And I think about the grief that is compounded by the people who couldn't even talk to their loved ones the few days or a week before they passed away. They might have waited for a healthcare provider, when the provider had time to make the call, call the loved one at home. And then that person might have been out that day, at that time. So all these things run through my mind. Is it healthy? No, I don't know about that. But it's like, I can't help it because this is how I think. I think about where the inequities in all of this. And as much as my situation was horrible, right? I just look at, I belong to this group on Facebook, this private national group called COVID Widows and Widowers. And there are people trying to grieve the loss of their spouse while they're trying to raise their children, and my dogs were stressed on me trying to go through the initial, I don't have children, and my dogs were stressed. I had to send Zora to Amy's for 2 weeks when Carla was on and off the ventilator, because she, Zora got into so much stuff. And I had the good sense to know that I didn't need that additional level of stress. And I said, come and get this dog. That's one less thing, and then like a year later, my poor Zora passes away. But, just imagine the people who are trying to grieve and they've got little kids,
And really important that we turn to that for a moment. I think the other thing that I think about is this concept of suffocated grief.
Oh.
And what suffocated grief really is the inability for us to recognize normative grief responses, especially in children and others, and we misrepresent them as behavioral problems. We misrepresent them in terms of lack of motivation. And this is related to systemic racism as well. This is especially troublesome within already marginalized communities where our baseline for evaluating behavior is that it's troublesome, as opposed to asking the question, which I have said to people over and over again: when you come into a context and you see kids or others acting out, the first question is what's happening to you, not what's wrong with you.
Yes.
But what's going on in you, and figuring out a way to respond to that reality first. And I think the other thing that you talk about very eloquently is the digital divide and the access to technology. Is many of us have had this experience in this time period where we have to deal with the range of experience with things like Zoom and other things, and the assumption that people know how to do that can lead to levels of anxiety and levels of of anger or levels of shame that we can perpetuate in the community because we say to people, well, you should. We don't say this necessarily, but we act like, well, why don't you know this?
Right.
I think about this with my own children. It's less of an issue there because I often turn to them and say, fix my phone, right? But, they're kind of the eye roll of, why don't you know how to do this, that comes out of that. If it's manifested in a larger community process as something's wrong with you because you don't know, as opposed to how can I companion you into a deeper understanding? What would be helpful to you? I had this wonderful experience of sitting down with one of the elders in my own congregation the other day. I said, bring your laptop with you. Let's sit side by side and you tell me what you're having issues with. And let's you and I just sit down and take whatever time it takes for you to feel comfortable. In an environment where it was just the two of us, we could do that. But this is a woman who has also lost her mother to COVID, who was living in a nursing home. And, you know, the issue of the vulnerability of our most of our oldest population to this in general, and the added issue of being in environments like healthcare facilities that were not prepared to deal with this, on top of the fact that they didn't know how to use the technology to be able to mitigate against some of it, is extraordinary. So I want to turn for a moment, and then I'm going to finish this last part because I want to introduce some mechanisms for some of our folks that are in the helping fields that are on this call. I'm wondering what was most helpful to you during the last 2 years. What sticks in your mind as things that were most helpful to you?
Well, you know, I was talking with Amy about this last night, and I was saying how, while I had a faith tradition, I was raised Christian, and so I take a lot of comfort in that. But I felt like it felt I felt like it fell short for me in terms of helping me to feel okay, really okay, about Carlo and my mom's passing, and meaning that, you know, I'm naturally curious, and I need answers for everything, and I know that's a lesson that I'm still learning, right? That sometimes there are no answers, but unlike when my dad died in 2013, and again, I had a major, it seems like my life has losses back to back. You know, I was diagnosed with breast cancer on April 1st, and my dad died on April 13th. And I just had to go into just work mode, for both myself and my dad. But something about when I lost my dad did not make me go down this road around, where is Carlo? I didn't say, where is my dad? Where is this? And I mean, like what I was taught growing up, and even in my adulthood, how I understood about spiritual, our spirits, from the Christian perspective anyway, was that yes, our spirits are eternal, but that wasn't enough for me. I'm like, yeah, okay, I can live with that. It's very cliche, like dad's in a better place, blah, blah, blah. But when Carlo left, this is a person, like when my dad died, I wasn't living in the house with him, right? I'm not seeing him 24/7. Carlo, 29 years, I mean, I met Carlo, we married when I was 29, and we were married for 29 years. So half my life, I lived with this person in this physical space. So I see evidence that he existed all around me. I see our home together. I see the deck that he loved, I see the gardens that he loved. And I'm like, well, I know he was here. Where is he now? And I needed to know that. And so I went down this road. And it's funny because I believe that God and the universe puts people and things in your path when you need them, right? And so I just happened, as I'm thinking all of this stuff, one of my good friends, Parlay Jones, her son, who I've known since he was a little kid, it's hard for me to think about him now. It's like, I call him my personal guru, he started talking to me about things like, like energetic, our body, our spirits is energy, and, how we can think about our spirits when we leave our physical body. And I started reading a lot of these different things that I did not find at all inconsistent at all with what I had been taught growing up in the Christian tradition. And well, I question everything about Christianity anyway and find what suits and fits me. But anyhow, I didn't find any of this inconsistent. And so that really helped me to think like not so, I wasn't so, not so hopeless, but like I felt more, okay, Carlo is not gone. Reading more about, I read the works like by Deborah, is her name Cannon? Is it Cannon? Cannon, yeah. And it all makes so much sense to me. And so, I posted something the other day on Facebook about like the law of thermodynamics and how, that the law is that energy doesn't, and I may not be repeating it word for word now, but energy doesn't ever disappear, right? It just transforms. And if that's the case, then Carlo is not here in his physical body, neither is my mom, but their energy is, I just can't see their energy. That's all. It's in a different form, right? And that gave me lots of solace, honestly, and the same thing with Zora. I know some people don't want to think about our animal companions as having spirits and souls, but I believe that, you can't tell me that Zora wasn't a little soul. And so having this new understanding about spirit, our spiritual nature, and the energy, and how it's energy and how it can inhabit different spaces, that has been tremendously helpful and comforting to me to think about Carlo, and that I'm going to our spirits and energy will be together again. And so that was really helpful. And another thing that's been really helpful for me is just, I think this it may not need to be stated, but I'll state it anyway, because I think it's kind of obvious, is that, support of friends and family. Sometimes you think, like, I know in my circle of friends, I'm the one that's always supporting and helping, right? I never really felt that my friends had the capacity, and I hope this doesn't sound like I'm being a jerk, but I never thought that my friends had the capacity to do, to support me in the way that I needed to be supported. And it's not a reflection on them. I think it's just a reflection on what I get from my family. I have a big family, and what I get from, not all of them, but some of my siblings. And I don't know. And so I was really quite surprised that my friends could give me, because you don't know what you think you need. That's another thing, right? And you have different friends that know different parts of you, right? And I realized, like, I have, like, my best friend from childhood, my friend Linda, she has seen me she's known me since I was 8 years old. So there's a way that, and she's known my family. So there's a way that she supports me that some of my friends in my that I made in adulthood can't support me. And so, and then there's the friends in the outer circle, like you have your inner circle, then your next circle, then there's the friends and acquaintances that you didn't really think that cared that much about you enough to do these things, to do like just things to support you, like come and weed your garden because they know how much my gardens mean to me, and like they know how I obsess with things, and like how it would just cause unnecessary stress if the month after Carlo died, I can't even get to my roses because there's stuff. So little things like that. You got the friends that will do stuff like that. They may not have the capacity to like sit with you when you're crying and give, but they like, I love you and I want to do these things that I know will take some stress off of you. So the friends who will just listen, they don't think that they have to fix everything. So that was really helpful to me. And it was helpful for me during this time to let people do things for me, because I'm not somebody who feels like I need a lot of help. But like when something slaps you like this, you don't know what you don't know how you're going to be. That's all I can say. And so friends and support of family. And then more recently, I'm learning that doing things, creative things has been helpful for me, like doing things with my hand, like my hands, like I've been making a wreath. I made a wreath for one of my friends, and, I've been doing this vision board stuff, and I don't know, like it just doesn't, I never thought about like, okay, somehow that it's just, I think when you're being creative, it's almost like a meditation, your mind's shut down for a minute and you're just in a zone. So I know I'm rambling, but then another thing that was really helpful for me, Aaron, was like, I feel like talking about how I'm feeling and sharing things on social media, I'm not trying to be like, an episode of Oprah and tell everything, right? Just like, but I think that we need to reclaim me as a Black person, particularly, and I think other Indigenous people, people need to reclaim. Other people of color need to reclaim their Indigenous way of doing things, including grief and how we experience grief. I was sharing with Aaron, like when I grew up in the Elm Park neighborhood, I couldn't, like, there were all these older Greek women that would walk around in the block, these widows, and they would do it for years. I mean, like, I remember from 5 years old to like 15 years old, they were still and I'm like, I get it now. They're doing that because it's a way to signal to the world, like, you see me, but you need to see me in the context of my loss. And that wearing that color, for them anyway, the color of Black, signals to the community, I'm in mourning. And so I feel like sometimes we need to think about the ways that we did things culturally, and maybe perhaps bring them back and make them more useful to us, because I feel like there's so much pressure for us in this Western European Christian capitalist environment to get on with it, right? We don't need to get on with it just so we can get back to work to make money for somebody else, right? And I know that we all have different economic situations and whatever, but there still is a pressure on everybody to get on with it and get back to work. And there was almost like a defiance from me, Aaron, is that I'm not going to let anybody tell me to get on with it. I'm not letting anybody tell me nothing. You go through it, then you tell me something. Otherwise, just keep your mouth shut. I'm going to do stuff the way that feels right for me. And even though we've been sold a bunch of lies around grief and loss, that they go through this and you go through that, that you should go back to work, you after a week or two. No, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing it. And I feel like just sharing in a real honest and raw way that is ugly and messy, sharing that like as best as I can on social media, lets people know that just because you see people out and about getting back to some semblance of normalcy doesn't mean that they're back to normal, okay? And that this is up and down, up and down, up and down. And somebody's got to have the guts to say this stuff. You know what I mean? Because it's like, it's just, you know what I'm saying? It's like,
I do. And, in many ways, what you're demonstrating by this very courageous and forceful way of being is also a reclamation of an assumptive world. You are claiming your power, and you are determined to do that in a way that also points to everyone's capacity to do the same thing. And in the face of something that was out of our control, that process becomes even more important as we determine what we can do and how we can be in the world. And I thank you for that.
Yeah,
I think it's an important thing for us to keep in mind. I'm mindful of the fact that we're an hour in. I want to turn for just a couple of minutes to some resources for those who are in the therapeutic community who are looking for some ways of being able to assess the kinds of things that we've been talking about. And I'm going to share my screen for a moment. I'm going to share three different things. One is what's called the COVID anxiety scale. And this is for those of you that are assessing people that you are looking at specifically because of anxiety symptoms that are showing. But this gives you a very quick way of determining the potential severity of the anxiety that people are feeling, from the somatic, lightheaded, faint, to the sleep and paralyzed or frozen, lost interest in eating, feeling nauseous in the stomach. this gives you some semblance of this. And I believe that the literature talks about if you have a total score of above 9, that gives you a sense of how significant the anxiety may be. The other that that Doka talks about in his material is the pandemic grief scale. This gives you a sense of, if you've got a number that is above 7 in terms of total, or if you have any of these that are above 3, or that are 3s, these are things to pay attention to. Wished to die in order to be with the deceased, experiencing confusion over my life role. Nothing seemed to matter much. Found it difficult to have positive memories. Believed that without the deceased, life was either meaningless, empty, or I couldn't go on. That gives you some sense there. And then finally, this is the last page of a paper about the unfinished business and bereavement scale. And I find this particularly generative in talking with people about their experience. And what I want to concentrate on here is that every story of grief is a story of, is a narrative of growth, has the potential of being a narrative of growth. And so there are two sides to any of these questions. Things like, I wish we did more things together, that lends itself to questioning, well, what kinds of things did you do together? Tell me about that. In other words, these questions are entrees into the narrative that can help ground people in the larger context in which a loss has occurred. Because what happens with grief and loss is we often become myopic in that and I don't mean that in a pejorative fashion, I mean we tunnel vision into this experience of loss. And part of the experience of kind of breaking open from that is to begin to discover the context of that experience within the larger context of our life with each other. And you'll see here a whole host of questions and the ability of people to mark the scale. And at the bottom of this is a means of scoring that gives you a number of parameters to consider. Let me see if I can get down to the bottom of this. It gives you both issues related to unfulfilled wishes, unresolved conflict.
That's good. Yeah.
And where's the other one? And the first 8 items can be used as a brief survey. In other words, if you don't have time to have people look at this, but I want to commend these to you. You can find the Corona anxiety scale, the pandemic grief scale, and the unfinished bereavement scale. All are online, and all are essentially open source for use. But for those of you in therapeutic contexts where you're looking for ways of engaging this process, I want to commend those to you. So I'd like to stop at this point and to open it up to the group. I think we have a hard stop at 1:30. Is that correct, Amy?
Not for me, but if you have, but we go till 2. But if you need to
Go to 2.
stop,
Well, no, we can go to 2. But we've spent half our time together, in presentation, and I really think that what we're talking about is conducive to conversation.
couldn't agree more.
Let me. I'm going to remove the spotlights here, and open it up for people that. And I would invite you to address anyone in the group. Myself, I'm certain that Joyce would also take questions, given that her narrative is so central to our experience today. And so I want to just simply open it up to you to ask what your response, your insight, your experience, your thoughts related to this? Anything we didn't talk about that you want to talk about more? And just so you understand, pastors are really, really comfortable with silence.
And please feel free to unmute yourself and just jump on in. Yay, Sharon.
I just want to think, I think I have lost all my siblings, all my mom, my dad. And Joyce, you said something that really, it put it all together. I wasn't ready to move on the way people thought I needed to move on. I didn't go through the phases of loss the way that everybody told me that I should go through phases. And being an evangelist minister, I knew what I needed to do in my religious upbringing,
Right.
but it didn't feel like enough. But as I tell people, I know it's hard, it's cliche to say, sit with it. And my favorite is lean in, lean in. There were days I could vacuum and I look across the carpet and I could smell my brother's cologne. And I knew his energy was here. And I wasn't ready to say, put him away and we've done all the things we needed to do and just move on. And so now over the years of all of that loss, I know now that they're all still around me in all different kinds of energetic ways, but always this,
Yeah.
It could be a thought, it could be a smell, it could be feel like a touch, it could be the breeze. I mean, it could just be, I turn around and knew that somebody's there. I mean, it's just these real things that make that physical being still around you. And my mother used to say to me, when someone loves you, they never leave you if you let them stay around you. Welcome the spirit to you. The only people that can hurt you is people that are living. And I began to hear those words my grandmama used to say to me. And so I just began to live with their spirits. So I can be driving, I can be doing anything in my normal day. And I feel it, sense it, and I just lean into it. Oh, I just surrender. Now, everybody doesn't have the privilege to do that, because there are some days that it's so heavy that I don't go to work. I don't make any phone calls. I don't want to get online. I don't want to see TV. I just want to feel. And you know what that's memory. I'm remembering the times. I'm remembering them. I keep them alive in a sense in me that still makes me whole, because they are part of who I am and I will always be. So I've learned to live and embrace that energy around me, that spirit around me, that love around me. And it's you. Everybody don't experience things to say. I'm just saying, this is the way I have been my experience. And the more I have leaned into it and just cut the rest of all of the logical world that I knew I should be out, I've come into a place that is I don't have the words to describe or call what it is, but I feel full. I feel joyful. I feel hopeful. I look forward. I feel innovative. I feel all of their strength that gives me that ability to feel. But it's been over time, from the first loss all the way to 2 years ago that I lost my brother, who I was his caregiver. And I mean, we were together thick and thin, and we were 2 years apart. So, but I also hear when you say, I lost my husband who I live with in this space. And I pray about that, God will allow me, if I lose my husband first, to allow me to lean in and still give me his promises that they will never leave you. I will never leave. You know, those are the things of losing 7 members of my family. That, and sometimes I feel I can be sitting in a park and I feel so alone. I don't have any family. Oh, but I have those friends in those circles you talked about that do all those different things for you. But you gotta be strong enough to let those people in. See, Joyce, you and I are very strong. You've been an advocate for people and counselor for people ever. That's who you were probably as a child. I'm not as inquisitive as you are on that front, but we have to find that inner self that we may have never met before. And I just say to you, welcome that self that you have never met before. Embrace, love that self, because you don't know, because you've never been here before. And I don't know what I don't know. So for me, I've learned to live in, lean in, but I have a full joy in my life through loss and through grief. And it takes time to find that. But give yourself credit and trust yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you.
Jane, Kamani.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Sharon, my thanks to you. Sharon is a good friend of mine. Thank you, Joyce, for sharing your story, as difficult it is. It brings a lot of encouragement to so many of us. And when you were talking, I thought about, you really mentioned about the iniquities in the system. And we grieve differently, but we all grieve. For me, coming from a different country, I'm an immigrant. And so when you grieve, you're grieving so many miles from your family. I've had losses back to back. And one of the things that I still miss to this day is I can remember the last conversation that I had with my dad. I can remember the last conversation I had with my brother, because they were in Africa, I was here. And then you have to take that flight that is so long for so many hours to go bury your loved one. And then you worry about your job. You worry when your supervisor tells you, oh, you were in Africa not long ago, you want to go again. So they really don't even care about, what you're going through. They are worried about that you're going to leave some work that is undone. And you also worry that you might not have an income when you come back. And we are not as strong, all of us are not as strong as Joyce, that you're like, I'm going to stay here as long as I can because there are bills to be paid and all that. I was talking to Sharon the other day when I called a 62-year-old lady. I was checking on her and she told me, Jane, my husband died yesterday from COVID and he died in Africa. And because she was undocumented immigrant, she couldn't go back to bury her husband of 35 years. And I kept wondering, how do you grieve without the body? And what even choice of words can you tell such a person? So even as we embark in this conversation, there are so many inequalities in the system. And because of who we are, where we come from, what we have and what we don't have. But I pray that in everything we'll find that peace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jane, thank you so very much. And I want to also, I want to talk about the resources that we have in Worcester and in other communities. But I think the conversation about spirit and ancestors, one of the things that I am doing right now is I'm teaching once again a sociology of death and dying course at Worcester State with a variety of teens and 20-somethings. And one of the things that I introduced them to is the cultural context, the difference in cultural context related to the death and dying processes. And they're introduced to the way in which there are so many cultures across the world that reverence relationship with ancestors,
Mhm.
and who have ritualized that process and who commemorate it throughout the year and who demonstrate the kind of wisdom that you all have spoken about in terms of welcoming and leaning into and feeling and allowing yourself to kind of just witness the presence of spirit. And I talk about it in terms of when someone comes into your mind, pause, give thanks. You know, I remember talking with folks about because we pathologize this experience.
Oh, that is
We
so
talk
true.
about it in terms of it being an interruption in our healing process instead of an invitation into healing.
Oh, that is
And
so
so
true.
within the context of grief work, the ability of people to free themselves up in order to be able to have conversations with those in their environments. I tell the story about my own father's death in 1994, and to this day, his picture hangs in my office. Early on in my own healing process, the first thing I did when I arrived in my office in the morning was shut the door and have a rather boisterous conversation with my dad.
Yeah.
And some days it was about ministry because he was also a minister and I could share with him all of the frustrations. And some days it was my remembering something that we did together. Some days I was angry because he wasn't there. And giving yourself permission to give expression to these things is a powerful form of healing. And I recommend it in terms of the kind of therapeutic interventions that we use with people that are stuck in grief. And I want us to be careful about even talking about stuck, because sometimes they're stuck because they're not on our time frame. But there is within complicated grief the notion of perseveration that it is the inability of someone to be able to function effectively over time in their environments. And so it's not when I talk about complicated grief and the perseveration that occurs sometimes with complicated grief, I talk about it in terms of the inability of someone to integrate the experience into their life over time. I have been in those situations where you walk into someone's house and, you know, it's been 15 years since the loved one died and they still haven't gone into their bedroom. Or they, you know, have set up and I'm less likely to use this experience now because I think that there are lots of people who put together home altars where they place precious objects and reminders, and they are able to return to that space. But there are those for whom time has stopped in a way that is inhibiting them from actually being able to live their lives. That, to me, is the call sign of some kind of intervention. Joyce, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, when you talked about the pictures and had things up, I just want to, you know, I'm going to get up and move around because I want to show you guys something. So, you know, Merck Dante Funeral Home that handled my husband and my mom's service, they give us these photos, right? And so, you know, that was part, and see, I don't know if you did these, it's dark over, you see, I have these big photos of Carla and my mom, and I have to walk by this is on a landing area going down to my basement, but I walk by this area every day. You know, I walk by this area, well, multiple times a day. And it reminds me that, I don't know, it's something about having the images of Carla and my mom there that reminds me that they're still here, you know? Their spirits are still there. I mean, I know some people and everybody deals with stuff differently, but sometimes people just they don't want to have any kind of, you know, memory, like anything to evoke a memory of the person, you know, like they just want, and I'm not judging that. I'm just like, that's how that people are coping. But for me, I couldn't cope that way. I couldn't like eliminate everything, you know, and no, like pretend like Carla didn't exist. I couldn't, you know, I know some people struggle with getting rid of some of their things, like, well, I'm a procrastinator, so it's going to take me forever to get rid of everything. That's just, so I can't blame that on, like, I do it gradually. And that was one thing that Carlo, like, he always got at me, like, Joyce, you need to get rid of this stuff. I'm like, yeah, whatever. So me not getting rid of all of his stuff is not about me, like, not wanting to, wanting to be, but it's more about me, like, I'm just slow at getting rid of stuff. But I don't want to forget that Carlo existed. I bring him up in the conversations, right, when I'm talking with people, and I think that that helps people too. I just want to model something different. That's right. I want to model something that looks different than what I've seen in this, this Western European based culture that's really rooted in, like, quick fixes, exactly. Monetary. It's all about, like, capitalism, like, get back to things as normal. They give us a week bereavement, like, somehow that's going to be so because they want you back to work and make money from it. So, but, like, I just want to do something different. I don't have any kind of I don't have any weird feelings about, like, just letting people know when I'm sad, or letting people know when I'm happy, or saying to people, look, you know what? Yeah, you see me doing this thing now, but hey, hold up. That's not necessarily because I'm all fixed now. Okay. I constantly remind people that I have my moments, right? Because I do think that it's so easy for us in this culture to see something and want to believe that that's how it is. We see somebody feeling good and acting okay, we want to believe for our own sake, right? Because we haven't, we're fearful about, like, our own future losses, right? So we want to tell ourselves, oh, people can get over stuff and get back to life, like, in a month, in a year. No, they get back to pieces of their life sporadically, right? But you don't know, nobody knows what happens inside people's heads. And nobody knows what happens on those days when you're not being seen by others, right? People only see you in a snapshot of time, and just because you see somebody seemingly back to normal doesn't mean they don't have their ups and stuff. So I just know for me, I've got to, like, I'm rejecting all of that stuff that, how things have to be. And I'm talking about stuff, and I want to normalize stuff, because people will, if I post something, people will message me privately and say, oh my God, I'm so glad you said that. I thought there was something wrong with me. People are, I had somebody say to me, that they thought that I needed, they met someone that they thought would be good for me. Like a relationship, right? Like, and this was like 6 months after Carlo passed away. Now, some people will, and I'm sure this person thought that, whatever, they were doing, but obviously she doesn't know me that well, because it's like, I know it's odd to think that I was in a relationship but I'm really not a relationship person. It's like, I'm not one of those kinds of people that has to be I married Carlo at 29. Okay. So I'm like, I'm not a relationship person. Like it was, Carlo was fashioned for me, because I can't even imagine that anybody else would want to be in a relationship with me the way that I need to be in relationships. So for somebody to think that because Carlo was gone, that somehow in 6 months I can swap him out, with somebody else. And then, it just, but I'm doing stuff the way that I want to do it. And I don't care what anybody, there's a defiance about it, because I think that we've been under this, it's oppressive. We've been under this oppressive notion for so long. I think that's what, and me too, I fell for all that crap, that I think that's the defiance aspect of it for me right now. It's like, society told me a bunch of crap. And so, like, I'm pissed off, and I'm gonna kick back real hard about it.
Let me take up one of the things that I think that, this notion of, we put time limits on grief. We have I think the latest statistics suggests we give people about 2 weeks to grieve a loss, and then we begin asking questions like, what's wrong? Because they're feeling sad. It's absurd. It's absurd even on the face of it, but that happens. My big concern about the nature of the complicated grief that we're in from the pandemic is that about 6 to 8 months after, things level off in terms of our pandemic response. My prediction is that we're going to start seeing implosions in families,
Yes.
in school systems, in workspaces, in congregations. And it is the latent emotional response to what has occurred that is surfacing in systems that are not able to recognize that this is a latent emotional response to grief, loss, and trauma. And we're going to pathologize it as behavioral issues, and we're going to engage in punitive responses that restrict people from access to community or take them out of school or what have you, when we ought to be leaning in that moment and saying what's happening for you, and where do we how do we reconnect them to the events that may have actually triggered this.
Mm.
And so I say that as a kind of a calling forward. But the other thing is, and I'm reading the chat, and Tara's just talking about hard when funeral services happen, and then everyone moves on to normal. This is,
Yes.
as a pastor, I experience this all the time. We come into relationship with people that are grieving for about 2 weeks in a month. We surround them with all kinds of things, and then we ebb back out into our lives, and it is as though there's a second grief experience that's happened because they feel abandoned by the person who died, and now they're feeling abandoned by community.
Yeah.
And it is important for us within congregational settings, within community settings, within our virtual spaces, to be able to hold space for the expression of that grief over a far more robust amount of time than
Yes.
we already do.
Yes.
And to recognize the need of people to retell the story. I'm one of those folks where people will come up and say, "I'm sorry if I've already told you this." And I said, "Please don't be sorry. Tell me again."
Mm.
Because my job is to listen to it as though it was the first time, and not to assume that someone, and I actually, this has become a really powerful intervention for people that are dealing with family members that have cognitive deficits that are beginning to show, and dementia and Alzheimer's and other forms. And they will come to me so distressed because they were in a conversation with someone and they asked the same question 10 times. And my response to them is not to concentrate on the person who is having the cognitive difficulty, but to say, what's happening to you when you hear the same question 10 times? Where are you going in this? Because you are the one who is in distress. The person who's asked the question 10 times is not in distress. And if you can hear those questions each time they're asked, like they're asked the first time, and bring the same kind of emotional experience to that, and let go of your need for them to remember, you may actually have a qualitatively different experience with them in the moment. And it happens in grief, where someone, and I found myself doing this, the same people that I told the story about my father's demise, I was telling them again. And we get fatigued in community as though, geez, didn't they remember they already told me that, or this is the umpteenth time. And I think we as community members need to remember that it is in the retelling of the story, it is in the recreation of the narrative, that we integrate the experience of loss into our lives. And it simply does not happen with one telling. It's about the capacity for us to say, tell me again, and have the same kind of attention to that as we did the first time. That's a spiritual discipline that as a community, we would be well worth us learning and dealing with. I also think in the future, in the coming months, we have got to find ways of rememorializing this experience, to bring some of the capacity for people to gather in community in order to remember back into community. because the ways in which we have offered our grief rituals have been, they were truncated out of necessity, but woefully inadequate in terms of the role that they play in the integration of loss into our lives.
Yeah.
So I would say that to you as well. Any other questions or thoughts?
Aaron, I was going to say something real quick. When you talked about I forgot the word you just used. God, see, this is the thing about grief too. It affects your recall, right? But anyway, it made me think about the whole idea of how grief has to be witnessed, and that's, I think, what's going to be it's just a layer of trauma for those of us who've lost loved ones during this pandemic that, again, like you were saying, we don't even know what the impact is going to be, that there wasn't when we memorialize, losses on this scale, we have monuments for losses on the scale of COVID, right? I know we've had the things I think, and I'm losing track of time, but I think back last year, soon after Biden was elected, they had some event on the National Mall, right? With candles or whatever. But even that was important, but even that, it was months after, the first deaths. And it does something to your soul when you have a loved one that is a part of a widespread loss like this, and there's no kind of collective, grief, I don't know, kind of collective, a day of mourning or I don't know. I mean, I thank God every day about the resources and different things that I have available to me and the people in my life, and I was able to have a wider, a bigger memorial for Carlo a year later, out here at my house in the summer. So people who couldn't come, and that gave me great comfort, right? And a year out after his death, I had a different way of looking at things, and I could really appreciate the kind things that people said about him a year out afterwards, And so I feel like if we had some kind of national, just a national recognition of the scale of this, you cannot talk about the scale of this loss, enough. We just get so desensitized, and I think about our young people, right? I have little ones, my nephews, and they're just, people say kids are resilient, but are they really? It's are they as resilient as we think they are? They're going through so much. I think about my nephews. They lost their uncle. They lost their grandma. They lost their life the way that they knew it, right? I don't know what effect that's going to have on them later, but I do know if we have some kind of acknowledgement that collectively, we all are walking around in a trauma.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you say that too. I think that's such a big piece of this, the sort of the not talking about it, pretending it's not happening, putting it on a happy face. And I think, people have so many different levels of things that they've experienced, right? And that's important to recognize too, that I think if you didn't have a loss at the magnitude of someone else in your life, you can feel really who am I to be upset? I didn't have this loss. Right. I mean, but so much loss. It makes me sad to look on Facebook at people selling prom dresses that they bought and never got to use. And that's not a death, but that's a loss. And we've all just had so many, and I so appreciate that people have spoken about the cultural response, the work response, this sort of idea that we're just keep on plugging along can really feel like you're betraying sort of your grief. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, Aaron. I think that's a piece that people struggle with, is like, how can I be happy in the world when all of this has happened? And, that sort of feeling like I'm expected to put on that happy face. Why can't I put on that happy face? And people have these levels, the stages that they feel like they have to follow. And they're like, well, I'm not in the stages. What? I know
First
you
of all,
don't.
I reject the notion of stages altogether. I talk about Kubler-Ross and others as dynamics of grief that can manifest themselves in any order that they come. It is the ability to recognize that they're dynamics, one of which, so let me give you an example in the pandemic. We are all very much tuned to the political hullabaloo that has gone on in our country that has coincided with the pandemic, and now the demonstrations in Canada and in other parts of the country related to vaccine restrictions. It has been helpful for me to think about the responses of some people in our country to vaccination and other public restrictions as a defense against the loss of their assumptive world. Now, you and I might agree that there was a need to lose that assumptive world altogether many times over and hopefully years ago, but the reality is that we as human beings have a variety of defenses to try to regain a sense of power, control, and predictability of our lives. And these this public theater of demonstration that we're seeing, I think we lose an opportunity to be in conversation if we don't recognize this as a part of a grief response, and as opposed to criminalizing it immediately. I understand the need for us to open up and to be able to respond effectively to dangerous situations and those kinds of things, but I don't want to lose the aspect of a very human attempt to try to regain a sense of power, control, and predictability. But the other piece of it is, this idea of I'm not in this space that everyone thinks that I should be in, is that we've got to stop shooting all over each other, and we do that in a variety of ways, and I think that again, for me, the orientation in these conversations is always not, why aren't you, but what are you? What are you feeling? What are you thinking? How is this living in you right now? To center on the experience as opposed to center on my reaction to the experience, which is most of the way that we respond in our culture to situations where we are discomforted. And to get out of the need to socially control everyone's behavior so we feel better, right? And recognize the need for us to again revisit things when people are in those spaces. You said something else, Amy, and I'm forgetting it right now about shoulda, woulda, coulda.
Maybe it was like the just different levels of loss, feeling like if your loss isn't,
Right.
if
So we
you don't have
shame
the
each
right
other.
to be sad about your prom.
Exactly. And so we do this, we engage in the competition for the allegiance to the worst loss. And it is, the game that we play where, well, if you think that's bad, and this is quintessential bar talk. You're three beers in, and you're going back and forth. But it is about the ability for us to get out of the need to compete for the worst loss scenario, and recognize that each individual loss has its own intensity. And one of my favorite examples of this is in my own context. As a part of our worship service, we have this moment called Joys and Sorrows, where people can share for a moment what's going on in their lives. And there was a particular Sunday where one woman got up and talked about the fact that her uncle or brother or someone had died from cancer, and how much she was grieving that. And the next person that got up talked about the death of their cat that weekend. And someone after the service approached me and they were absolutely enraged. And I said, well, what's happening to you? And she said, well, I just can't understand how that person who lost their cat thought it was appropriate to get up and talk about that loss after the other person had talked about the death of their brother. I mean, don't they understand that they're quintessentially different experiences, essentially? And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. I said, first of all, you're making a lot of assumptions about the meaning of these losses because they've been shared in this public forum. You know, I didn't say to her, well, I happen to know that the woman who talked about her brother had been estranged from him for 20 years and was pissed at him for most of that time, and that the other who lost their cat, the cat had seen her through the death of 2 children, the divorce from her husband, and the move to a different part of the country. You know, so we make assumptions about what is, you know, what is important and not important in terms of the kinds of losses that have been experienced. But I think, you know, we can't make those assumptions. Someone who has lost a family member, that can be a grievous loss. And I use the word can. It most often is, but it's not always, depending on the quality of the relationship. Or the child who has, you know, my daughter spent her final semester in college at home. Did not have a graduation for 1.5 years after she graduated, did not have the final parties that they have at school. She's never going to recover that. Never. Is it right for me to make the assumption that her sense of loss in that circumstances is less traumatic than the loss of the death of someone? No. Because it has to be viewed within context. And we have to do that
I wanted to ask
consistently. We have to do that.
Reverend Payson, I was going to ask you about that in terms of, you know, our young people that did not go through a graduation. And I remember back on my graduations and my proms, and those things still stay with me even as I've retired and moved on. Mm-hmm. That I think kind of those traditional things that gives us permission in life to move on as adults, or transitions us. And these are large numbers of our young people that I worry and pray about every day, that where will that loss show up one day in a college classroom, picking up a gun? Where will that, and I think that's why, you know, you and I work on the mental health and working on that's why I think it's incumbent upon us as a nation, as a society, as a small community, to start getting prepared for the mental health pieces that's going to come with that.
Yeah. And I think it's incumbent upon us as communities to be thinking creatively about how we support resiliency.
Yes.
You know, how we do the work that mitigates against the eruption of violence or the eruption of mental illness because of these experiences of deficit. You know, I can imagine us as a community having a community-wide prom at some point.
Yes, yes.
I mean, or you know,
major graduation at the
You
ballpark.
know,
I mean,
ways that we as a community can say we hear you, and this isn't the same thing, but it is something that we can do to honor you. And I think that, you know, as in my own context as congregations, we have to be thinking about rethinking our rituals in order to be able to incorporate, you know, the loss of the definitive experiences of ritualizing death and mourning, and figure out ways of continuing that work, both within our own contexts, but also within the community at large. I was grateful that the city marked the first anniversary of the COVID-19. I hope they'll mark the second. But I think that we have to find some way of publicly demonstrating our continuing consciousness of this in a way that reflects. And I'm mindful that all of us on this call have gone through this experience when it came to 9/11. For the first decade or so, we saw annual honorings of that, and we still see national honorings of it. But we have gone through the cycle of intense response to more ritualized kind of observances, to now casting our gaze to a national level for the continuing observances. And I am continually mindful of the fact that we have people in our midst and in my own congregation who still grieve the loss of children and spouses and sisters on those planes and in those buildings.
Yes.
So ways for us to continue to be conscious of that and to respond to the need as it is manifest. Any other comments or responses?
And
Yes.
I think, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry, Amy. I have not been able to add to the chat. I was just going to put this in the chat, but when I lost the love of my life, I was alone and no one knew him really because he's not from here. And it just hit me really hard. And I just could not stop crying that day. And a friend just came by out of magic because she never just stopped by ever. And she just came in and she sat there with me and held my hand. It was awesome. I had that and I wanted to share that.
That is huge, Nancy, and thank you for saying that.
Mm.
When Joyce talked earlier about this kind of experience of friends, I was mindful of Rabbi Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People.
Good people.
And he talks in that experience about a young boy coming home and his parents saying, well, why were you late? And he said, well, Mikey's bike was broken. And the response was, Mikey's bike was broken. You stopped and helped Mikey fix his bike? He said, oh, no, I don't know how to fix the bike. I just stopped and helped him cry.
Right. Well, this is at that same time, all of a sudden I had this, and my inner self is known to act out unbeknownst to my practical self a lot. And we've had a lot of wonderful life lessons from that, which are another topic. But during that time, all of a sudden I had this euphoria that anyone observing it would have just thought, how really inappropriate is that? I was higher than a kite for a few minutes because it occurred to me that I loved him so much that I hurt this much. And I was allowing myself to hurt like hell because I've learned you need to allow pain, because if you stuff it, you screw yourself. But I loved him so much. How cool was that?
Yeah.
How freaking cool was that? That I could love him that much to hurt that really, really worse in my whole life, and I've been through a lot. I thought that was so cool.
Really cool.
Yeah?
And so very important to remember that our grief is often commensurate proportionally to the amount of love.
Yeah.
You know?
And I didn't know that. I mean, I've lost others, but this one was the deepest. And how cool is that we can love that hard? Who knew? You know?
That speaks very much to the resiliency of the human spirit, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm ever grateful for the spirit within me that takes over and solves problems that I have actually let go to her, because working and thinking and planning and doing all the shoulds was really getting tiresome, and I'm an old lady. Yeah, that's I'm done. No filters. Go for it, girls and boys. Just live it out.
When I am old, I shall wear purple. Do you know that poem?
I know all about it, and I'm a painter, and I paint with very strong colors. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
That's kind of a nice place to stop, Nance, too, because right, it does help you feel like you can make some meaning, you can move forward. There can be happiness on the other side. It's not always doom and gloom. We can and just the sort of connection of it, right? It's a trauma training for a reason. One of the pieces that happens so much in trauma is when you tell somebody what's happening, how they respond to you is the single greatest predictor of how you're going to do in the future when it comes to at least the trauma of child abuse. And I didn't really connect that until you talked about it now, but I think that's going on all the time, right? Like people are having these awarenesses, all these losses. It's so much, but it's also a place where when people are there with you in that loss, in that pain space, you never forget that. It's more important than anything else. And you know, like Aaron, you started us with that kind of hopeful piece of how much community blossoms and builds and flourishes post trauma, right? Like after things, and that gives me hope, because I absolutely see evidence that can come to fruition in many of the communities I'm in, that people can get to the other side, and they're so glad for anyone who helped them get there, that they're very willing to help anyone behind them. And those are the structures we have to, you know, set up for our future post-COVID anyways.
And I think about this in terms of the binary of griefs and gifts, gifts, right? While this time has had so many different griefs, I can also remember that, you know, it has given me the gift of being able to reach more people than I could on Sunday morning when they all had to come in person. You know, it has given me the gift of being able to meet people in spaces that are most comfortable for them. In my congregation, as an example, who, you know, not being conscious fully of the, you know, the enormous energy it takes to bring young ones on Sunday morning to service, or those who have partners who are struggling with, you know, dementia issues, and how much anxiety is associated with getting them ready, getting them on time, and then attending to them in that space, and how much this experience has allowed people to come in their jammies and sit on the couch and really engage in worship, right? And not have to worry about how they look, or whether the kids are behaving or not, because they're in, I mean, this is all, we can look at the grieves, but I think we have to look at the growth and gifts that come too. Not that they're equal necessarily, but that they both are.
Amen.
Well, good people, you have spent another 2 hours of time together. That is remarkable given the kind of schedules that we're keeping these days. I am honored to have spent this time with you. I hope that it has been generative for you.
Thank you.
You know, you're welcome to contact me at any point along the way. Amy can share with you contact information if you want more resources. I will share with Amy the PDFs that I referred to in terms of the
those were great, Aaron. Yeah.
Used, and you know, hopefully, as you desire, if you want to talk more, give me a holler. We'll do whatever. I will say that one of the things I'm looking at is the same foundation that published this book, which I strongly recommend, Living with Grief Since COVID-19, from the Hospice Foundation of America. I have purchased their curriculum that is associated with this material, and plan to offer it in, I'm talking with Amy about doing a community-wide offering, but we'll offer it in the context of the congregation I serve as well. It's conducive to two 2-hour sessions. There's a 120-minute video that's a part of this. And so my hope is to figure out an experience where we can share portions of the video and be in conversation to continue this work.
That sounds great. Yeah, it's so hard to come together about hard things, but so powerful. It's been really just pleasurable to have people share and, you know, let their kind of sadness out. It's so hard, but so important. And I'm so grateful to you, Aaron. You always make the space for that and have all the right things to say that give me so much food for thought going forward and comfort. So just thanks so much to all of you. It's hard when you're in grief to be grateful, but this community gives you so many reasons.
And my profound thanks to Joyce for her sharing today. Very, very grateful for her wisdom and her experience and her courage.
She's pretty great. Thank you all so much. I'll post all the things on Facebook too.
Great.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Not alone. You're not alone.